Amid the prolonging trade spat with Japan, South Korea has decided to lodge a WTO complaint on September 11th. Seoul has decided to carry out the measure since Tokyo's tighter export controls are affecting economies of both nations. Data shows the number of South Korean travelers to Japan in August has reduced 19.5% on year. The continuation of the nationwide Japanese boycott in South Korea is also affecting the Japanese economy. South Korean firms were expected to see damages due to Japan's export restrictions, but they are making notable steps by localizing materials and diversifying import routes. Japan is taking backfires as South Korea is figuring out ways to evade the curbs. It would be important to see if Seoul and Tokyo could find a breakthrough to alleviate economic damages and mend their bilateral ties.
Hello, welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Daniel Che. Seoul and Tokyo's ongoing trade dispute is spilling over to various sectors, ultimately affecting the economies of both sides. Companies from both countries are struggling to roll with the punches. While this is going on, South Korea filed an official complaint with the WTO regarding the matter. We have a panel of experts from inside and outside of the nation joining us for an in-depth discussion on this topic. So, let's get to the point. To help us dissect today's topic into digestible bites, we're joined in the studio by Professor Shin of Sungmyung Women's University. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, South Korea has decided to lodge a WTO complaint over Japan's trade restrictions, certainly a move that will add more tension to the ongoing conflict.
Well, the Korean government has pledged to bring this matter to WTO as soon as this kind of friction broke out early, I think, July. So we expected that, Korean government's action into WTO was pretty anticipated and expected. So there's nothing surprise about that. The problem is, the resolution or the solution in WTO is going to be pretty lengthy. It's going to take a long time. And the critical handicap is that there is no penalty other than long process of, dispute settlement. So whether it is effective or not, that might be put into question, but Korean government has announced that, it's going to bring that matter to WTO. So we expected that.
So I suppose Japan was expecting this to be a natural progression as well.
Yes. And they know that handicap of WTO. And America and Japan has been two most important countries who emphasized the problem of WTO system. So they don't be pretty much surprised by Korean action bringing that into WTO.
It's unique how the Japanese are able to segment their emotions and logic side by side. Well, Japan triggered the trade war, many would agree. The export curbs backfired somewhat, though. Let's find out through a clip what kind of repercussion Tokyo is experiencing.
Amid the prolonging trade spat between Seoul and Tokyo, the Japanese industries are taking heavy blow due to the continuation of South Korean boycott of Japanese products and reduction in the influx of travelers from South Korea.
우리나라 입장에서 일본은 기본적으로 가해자입니다. 가해자가 피해자한테 그렇게 보복을 하고 이러한 것들은 우리 국민들의 반일 감정을 더 키울 뿐일 거고요.
Japanese carmaker Nissan is reportedly considering a pullout from South Korea. It only sold 58 cars in August, about an 88% drop from a year ago. The Japanese tourism industry has registered negative figures in August. Reports show 970,000 South Korean travelers visited Japan last month, down 19.5% from last year's figure. As the number of South Korean tourists continue to slide, Japan has even come up with one-way flight tickets back to South Korea that's worth only $9. The South Korean boycott of Japanese products and tours are negatively impacting the Japanese economy. Experts say Tokyo should follow up with a discreet action to reduce the damages from the backfire triggered by its export curbs.
So, South Koreans right now, they're voluntarily carrying out boycotts. Japan seemed quite alarmed because the move hampers tourism, various sectors, including auto and alcohol as well. How adversely are the firms and regional cities affected by this boycott?
Well, for the month of July and the month of August, Japanese exports to Korea declined about 7% year to year. But Korean export to Japan has not been pretty much influenced. Many media argues that is the sign that Japanese, the effect of boycotting has more damage to Japan. But if you look at the data prior to that conflict, for the month of June, for the month of May, throughout this year, Japanese exports to Korea has been declining about 7%. So, to me, negative 7%, increase in Japanese export to Korea is not because of, Korean boycotts. It's been that way from the beginning of this year. So, to me, looking at the statistics, the effect of Korean boycotts or Korean conflict against Japan has not been materialized significantly in the data. We have to see down the road. So the economic data does not show any significant effect except for Korean tourists into Japan. That has been pretty, I think, significantly affected by Korean boycotts. But other than that, commodity trades or other service trades, there hasn't been any significant effect of Korean, Japan conflict, at least so far.
Well, some reports, including Mainichi Shimbun, they reported that Japan is second-guessing or thinking that maybe they misread the situation in terms of their action towards South Korea. Mm-hmm. What are the chances of such doubts prompting Japan to shift its stance?
Well, if you look at the attitude of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo emphasized many times the reason that they brought this issue into the removal of white list is very clear. The message is very clear, and I believe that as long as their goal or their intention is not satisfied by Korean government's action, I think this kind of conflict will persist a very long time. So no matter what, the media, Japanese media criticize Abe, always there has been criticism against Abe. So we should not mistaken to believe that a few kind of a criticism made by Japanese media is a token that Abe Shinzo will change his. I think the Abe Shinzo's, conviction to this matter is very strong. And today they shuffled in the cabinet member. And if you look at the member, there has been any significant change in the mind of Abe Shinzo. So we have to know, what is their target in order to solve this problem as soon as possible.
Well, let's hope they understand there's more to the Japanese administration than meets the eye.
Right.
We'll turn to some opinions from outside of Korea for now, Professor.
Okay.
Now, time for our first Skype session. We have an expert to tell us how the rest of Asia is thinking about the South Korea-Japan trade conflict. David Lee, Senior Lecturer of Business and Economics at Hong Kong University, is with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm excited to join The Point today.
Thanks for being here with us. Both countries' economies are adversely affected by boycotts and trade restrictions. How serious is the problem, David?
Well, certainly the problem has become more and more serious. The situation, I think, is continuing to escalate. You mentioned a few things with respect to consumption patterns, both in terms of tourism, in terms of, in particular places like in Korea, there's a general boycott of Japanese products, and that's increasing. I think more broadly, the seriousness of the issue, you're starting to see it in kind of supply chains, in how the intertwining of Japanese and Korean supply chains is more and more apparent.
Lastly, before we let you go, what kind of impact would the trade spat have on Hong Kong and other Asian countries? And what sectors would be most affected by it?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think overall, what we're seeing in Asia is actually a high period of volatility, actually. And at least in my view, it's not quite clear who will potentially benefit from that. I mean, I think the initial response from both an economic and strategic political and security standpoint is that potentially China could rise and fill a void, both in terms of the supply chain that we discussed earlier and replacing Japanese suppliers for certain goods that South Koreans may need in their supply chain. But more broadly, in terms of security, I mean, I think this definitely opens a window for China to exploit, as potentially as well as North Korea, with the ongoing kind of weapons and nuclear testing issues. But from a more high level, when we look at the region, I think more broadly, there's a lot of volatility. So you look at U.S.-China trade, the U.S.-China trade kind of issue right now. You look at the issues going on in Hong Kong at the moment. You look at the relationship between Japan and Korea. In general, there is a high level of potential and increasing amounts of risk and volatility. I think in the greater context of a global economy that is potentially slowing by a lot of indicators, there's a risk of an economic slowdown in the near to medium term. I think it's quite difficult to predict that future of who will kind of emerge victorious in the long run.
All right, David, thank you for your insights and your expertise. We appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to join The Point today.
Likewise. Well, Japan's trade curbs were designed to hamper Seoul's main sectors. Instead of buckling under pressure, the Korean government and local firms showed what they can do with their backs to the wall. So let's take a look at the various efforts made to alleviate the damage.
Amid Japan's trade curbs, South Korean firms are finding breakthroughs by localizing parts, materials and diversifying import channels. LG Display has succeeded in utilizing domestic etching gas for the production of display panels. Samsung Electronics also has started to use homemade etching gas in parts of its chip manufacturing line.
소재 부품 장비 산업 경쟁력 강화는 경제 강국을 위한 국가 전략 과제입니다. 한일 관계 차원을 뛰어넘어 한국 경제 100년의 기틀을 세우는 일입니다.
With export routes shut down, the Japanese firms have started to move their manufacturing lines to South Korea and China to evade Tokyo's export curbs. Seoul's plan to reduce dependence on Japan is gradually seeing progress. It is to be seen whether its policies could open up new opportunities for domestic businesses.
So companies in Korea, they have been and they still are trying to reduce dependence on Japan's parts and materials, and select firms reportedly have already made significant progress.
Well, the parts, materials, and equipment reliance on or dependence upon Japan has been pretty long. At least 3 decades ago, we've been depending too much upon Japan or Japanese products. So many analysts and scholars have emphasized that we have to. You should be able to localize, critical, items. But a little belated, but this is a pretty important moment or pretty important time that we have to be able to localize critical items. And the big companies like Samsung and LG or Hyundai Motor Corporations or POSCO, they have the capability to do it as quick as possible. And we see practical data that many of the big companies are succeeding in either substituting from other sources or being able to supply locally. But the problem is not the big firms, but there are so many medium-sized firms which have been relying too much upon Japan, and the government has to put more resources and support to those small and medium firms which has been relying too much upon Japan. And that, I think, is the real challenge for this government to get over this Korea-Japan conflict.
And it's always good to have the government's support, and the Moon administration announced plans to invest heavily to help with the localization of parts and materials and equipment industries.
Right.
How would you rate such efforts so far, although it's still an at infancy.
Right. Yeah, I have been emphasizing, that the real challenge or real task for Moon's government has been this way from the start of this government, but already 2.5 years has passed, right? But yeah, as I said, this is a little belated, but it's not too late. This is the time that Korean government put more resources, pour more manpower into the localizing these critical materials and critical parts. And the future of Korean economy relies not on Samsung, not on LG, not on POSCO, but rely upon possibility or realization of small and medium size, being able to create this kind of innovative parts and materials. And that, I think, is the real challenge for this government. And the entire Korean future economic development rests upon these critical topics and critical challenge.
Better late than never. And of course, for the government's part, it's not just about supporting, but also not being or standing in the way.
Right. Right. The Japan, even though we have conflict, I think there's a room for cooperation between Japanese firms and Korean firms. We cannot, of course we can, but it's going to take a lot longer and a lot more difficult. So I think we have to extend our tie or friendly relationship, Japanese cooperation, not Japanese government, but we have to cooperate with the Japanese, Japanese corporations in order to speed up our technological development. In that respect, I think Japanese cooperation is pretty critical. So I think we have to follow the two tracks. We disagree with Japanese government on many political and diplomatic issues, but we should not be, opposing in the corporate sector. We have to cooperate, and by doing so, Japan will be able to take some advantage from Korea, and also Korea could take some advantage from Japanese corporations. So this is cooperation and mutually advantageous cooperation. So I think we should not confuse the conflict between two governments and the cooperation between two industries, between Korea and Japan.
Whenever there's a fight, whether it's between people or groups, there usually tends to be a voice at the back of their head saying, somebody hold me back.
Right.
It seems to be possibly the situation, especially with the corporate sectors involved. Well, we're going to come back to you in a while, Professor. We'll turn to another Skype interview that we have set up. Now, it's time to speak to another expert about how the rest of the world is looking at the effects of the bilateral trade war. Troy Staggerin, Senior Director of Korea Economic Institute of America, is connected via Skype. Hello there.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for making time for us. Well, South Korean companies are focusing on localizing parts and diversifying import channels. Do you think reducing reliance on Japan would open up new opportunities for its firms?
In time, this could lead to new opportunities for South Korean firms. The tech industry tends to be very specific in the quality and the purity of some of these chemicals that South Korea is trying to now localize. But if South Korean firms are able to demonstrate that they can take and produce in large quantities and of the right purity and quality, then it might open up the opportunity for firms to maybe in time switch to them as well. So there could be new economic opportunities for South Korean firms from this situation.
Well, after the trade restrictions, Troy, Japanese suppliers started to move their manufacturing lines to China and South Korea. Will this weaken Japan's economy in any way?
While things like hydrogen fluoride are critical to the production of semiconductors, they aren't necessarily large value items. And so what this will do is it'll have probably minimal effect on the Japanese economy itself, especially because a lot of these Japanese firms are setting up shop outside of Japan to be able to continue to supply their customers. That being said, it will reduce the leverage of the Japanese government to use this type of tool in the future against other countries.
As this conflict prolongs between South Korea and Japan, which side is likely to be more adversely affected?
I think, a lot of this depends on how things play out. Right now, Japanese companies, for example, Nissan is thinking about perhaps withdrawing from the South Korean market because of the boycott and some other factors beforehand. Uniqlo has seen perhaps 70% drops in sales. So there's specific impacts on Japanese companies. That being said, the overall impact could be larger on South Korea, depending on what Japan does over the next few months, perhaps restrict, and if that then interferes with production on the South Korean side. So a lot of this will depend on how it plays out. I think in the short term, we're seeing clearly on the consumer side an impact on the Japanese economy. But, in terms of the broader manufacturing, South Korea could actually face larger losses depending on how things play out.
All right, Troy, we appreciate your insights on this particular matter.
Thank you.
Coming back to you, Professor Shin, some in Japan fear Tokyo misread the situation and underestimate Korea's new economic plan.
Right. But as the newspaper read today, a number of Japanese companies located in Korea decided to move or decided to turn back to Japan, and on the other side, many Korean products like automobile or steel product or machines, we need critical parts from Japan, and when Japan decided to control the export of those critical items to Korea, we are going to have significant kind of a bottleneck in producing automobile and the machines and those kind of stuff. So it's not just a semiconductor. Okay, broad range of commodities will be affected by Japan, and I think Japan is calculating to their most efficiency, right? How could they lead us, to their objective of getting their initial objective of, the changing Korean kind of a stance against the 1965 agreement. So I think the real challenge will be seen sooner or later. As he said, it's how it's going to play out in the future. That's the most critical. So I think that the matter should be resolved as soon as possible, and that's why if this kind of a standstill continues between two countries, of course Japan will lose a lot, but the Korean company, Korean economy also will lose a lot, and I dearly hope that this matter should be resolved. I think there should be some kind of hidden talks between two governments. So I keep fingers crossed that sooner or later this matter resolved very suddenly.
Even when it comes to intergovernmental relationships or talks, there are various sectors. How would you advise, a top-down or a bottom-up approach?
Well, I think this is determined by, this is invoked by Prime Minister Abe. So we have to talk to Prime Minister Abe, and we have to have the list. What do you want? We have a list, at least the 3 or 4 options, and then talk in Korean government and listen to their kind of needs and modify. In that way, I think the problem could be solved instantaneously. Otherwise, keep pressing boycott, keep escalating the emotional kind of challenge between two countries. It's not going to help the problem. So I think the Korean people should calm down, as Japanese people are pretty calm down, and this has to be solved by two governments, especially the President Moon and the Prime Minister Abe, right? The other, I think, kind of a solution is not essential. So the Abe, removing the mind of Abe is very important, okay, as long as the forced labor issues or compensation for those people, I think that's a critical issue. And I think, before the end of this year, I think this kind of a critical conflict could be and would be resolved.
Right. As time passes, and if you don't move forward together, there's not really a lot of pluses for either sides. We do hope that some of your prophecy come true in the near future. Professor Shin Se-dun, thank you so much for coming in today. We appreciate you coming in and making our program complete today.
My pleasure always.
We have more updates on the rapid changes and developments in the ongoing trade dispute between South Korea and Japan. So let's take a look.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made major changes to his cabinet on Wednesday to enhance his government's stability and effectively tackle major challenges. He replaced 17 out of 19 cabinet members, the largest reshuffle since Abe retook office in 2012. Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso and Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga are the only aides who will keep their current posts. This reshuffle involves some key ministers who will have a clear impact on the direction of Korea-Japan relations. Foreign Minister Taro Kono has been named Japan's new defense minister. Kono has taken a hardline stance on the South Korean Supreme Court's decision on forced labor and the two countries' military intelligence sharing pact. His shift to the defense ministry is a sign Abe will stick to his strong stance against Seoul. And replacing Kono as foreign minister will be Toshimitsu Motegi. He was promoted for his part in negotiating a trade deal with the US and is well known for having been a tough negotiator in the process. Japan's export restrictions on Korea will now be overseen by Issue Sugawara. Also seen as a right-winger, Sugawara is expected to build on the administration's firm position in its trade conflict with Seoul. And the education minister will be Koichi Hagiuda. He's likely to continue to distort history in Japan's textbooks by including Japan's false claims to Dokdo Island and misrepresenting Japan's sexual enslavement of Korean women during World War II. It's widely believed that the shakeup means relations between Seoul and Tokyo will get even worse. Also notable is Abe's pick of a rising star in Japanese politics, Shinjiro Koizumi, as his environment minister. The son of former Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, he's seen as a top contender to become the next leader. His inclusion is seen as a way to win public support.
Galapagos syndrome refers to how a country that continues to be fixated on its ways and remains oblivious to the changes around it continues to be isolated from the rest of the world. Ironically, this Darwinian-sounding term is coined by Japan. Perhaps it's time for Tokyo to reflect on its past wisdom when making decisions in the near future regarding the ongoing trade dispute. That's all we have for you at this hour. Do join us again, same time next week, for a brand new episode of The Point.